Welcome back to Gaza now, because today the human rights group Amnesty International directly accused Israel of committing genocide there. Amnesty says Israel has deliberately destroyed Palestinians and denied them food and other supplies with genocidal intent. Accusations vehemently denied by Israel. So what exactly are Amnesty saying in their report? The human rights group cites the Genocide Convention, which describes it as acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethical, racial or religious group. Amnesty says Israel's actions in Gaza meet that threshold on at least 3 out of 5 conditions listed in the convention. The first 2 of them being the killing and causing serious bodily or mental harm. Amnesty investigated 15 Israeli airstrikes that killed at least 330 people. Including this one in Rafah on the 20th of April. Airstrikes destroyed a family home, killing 16 children. Amnesty say they found no evidence that any of these strikes were directed at military targets. Another condition highlighted in the report is inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about physical destruction. Using satellite imagery, they have mapped out huge swathes of agricultural land damaged by Israeli operations, as well as homes and critical infrastructure. Amnesty estimates that 1.9 million Gazans have been displaced as a result of Israeli action. That is 90% of Gaza's population. And finally, the human rights group have investigated the scale of Israel's intent to destroy. They've reviewed hundreds of videos from officials and military on the ground, including soldiers apparently making light of the destruction. Amnesty says the lack of action by the international community amounts to what they describe as a seismic and shameful failure. Well, joining me now is the Secretary-General of Amnesty International, Agnes Callamard. Mrs. Callamard, thank you so much for joining us tonight. What seems to be central to the very grave allegation of genocide, particularly against a nation whose was set up because of a genocide against them, a very real genocide, the Holocaust in World War II. Central to that allegation has to be proving intent. Acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethical, racial or religious group. So I think it's important to start there. How can you prove that the intent amongst Israeli soldiers, commanders and officials was to commit genocide?
We prove it on the basis of what the jurisprudence has said, which is you need to take into account all the conduct of a state, in this case Israel. You need to look at it holistically. You need to take into account the repetition, the occurrence, the reoccurrence of those acts. You need to identify the patterns. You need to determine whether there are plausible explanations. You need to look at direct information such as statements being made by the authorities, statements being made by soldiers on the ground. And we followed those instructions. I should also highlight that the jurisprudence clearly states that in an armed conflict situation, there can be other objectives beside genocidal intent. And we are in the context of an armed conflict. So, of course, Israel has military objectives, including those to eliminate Hamas. But that military objective can coexist alongside genocidal intent. And this is what we have demonstrated in that report on the basis of the jurisprudence and international law.
OK, but if you talk to Israeli officials and what they've said, and they said it to the ICJ, was some of these comments were exaggeration, they were hyperbole, in a region where everyone indulges in hyperbole, and they were made at a time, an extremely distressing, traumatising time, the moments in the aftermath after October the 7th. And therefore they should be cut some slack here. When they talked about completely cutting off Gaza, that was an exaggeration. Are you misreading possibly what the Israeli officials said and thereby unfairly accusing them of this very grave crime against humanity?
No, we haven't. First of all, the statements are only one small part of the evidence. What I want to insist again on the conduct of Israel in Gaza over the last 14 months. And that conduct demonstrates that many of the actions repeated over time had no military necessity and no military objective. The starvation of the Gazaean, of the population, the fact that they have no access to drinkable water, the destruction of the farming lands, the destruction of homes and infrastructures, even after the militaries had gained military control over them. The repeated evacuation order to move people to places even smaller and smaller without any conditions there to allow them to live. The fact that now people live without any dignity, that they have to fight to get a piece of bread, the absence of medicine, the fact that surgeons cannot operate, the doctors cannot practice, kids
right,
are born
I'm sorry to interrupt. Are you saying that all of that
have no military necessity? That is the point. They have no military necessity. The only
yes.
objective behind those acts is the action to destroy the Palestinian people, civilians. That is part of genocidal intent. The statements made are only an additional evidence being provided, and we
look at
those statements.
Sorry, Ms. Kalama, I had to interrupt because we have limited time. If I could just
October 7, we've looked at them over 6 months period. We've looked at statements by soldiers throughout the period under investigation. So we are not just looking at the first days after the heinous crimes of Hamas of October 7.
Let me ask you this. Are you convinced in your mind that the Israeli government and Israeli leaders genuinely want to wipe out the Palestinians of Gaza? That is their clear intent, and that's what they're doing. Because if that's the case, why are they calling ahead buildings that they're going to strike by the air to warn people to get out? Why are they letting in aid, albeit imperfectly, but they are letting aid in, and they have been in hundreds of trucks, they would say? That's not really compatible, surely, with a government trying to wipe out an entire race, is it?
Absolutely not true. It's absolutely not true. First of all, our investigation has shown that in the 15 cases that we have thoroughly investigated, it's only the tip of the iceberg. We have many more evidence to it. But in those 15 cases, only in one case were people told that there was gonna be an attack. So it is not at all the norm for Israeli to warn people, and warnings are not amounting to taking necessary precaution. In fact, most of those warnings have been known to create chaos, to create panic. They happen in the middle of the night, which is the other thing that is characteristic of this military operation. The use of huge bombs when it is not necessary in an immensely populated area. The use of such weapon is meant to inflict the greatest number of casualties. They are used at night when people are asleep. There is no military necessity there when there are no Hamas fighters located, and they are not everywhere, sorry. So,
right.
You're talking about humanitarian aid. The little piecemeal approach to the provision of humanitarian assistance is shameful. You just need to look at the result on the ground. People have no food. The rate of malnutrition, the rate of diseases, the absence of,
Sorry to interrupt,
there is absolutely, go ahead.
If I take your point about the aid, if I could just finally put to you that in response to this, an Israeli official said to Sky earlier that Amnesty doesn't accept, he says, that Israel should exist. And Israel was born guilty, he said, back in the 40s. Is that true? Does Amnesty accept that Israel has a right to exist?
Absolutely not. Actually, we've said it repeatedly since, for as long as we have existed ourselves, that, of course, Israel has the right to exist, that Israeli people, Jewish people, have a right to self-determination. We have recognized that, in fact, the state of Israel has a right even to be a Jewish state, provided it is not discriminating against non-Jewish people. So it could not be further away from the truth. We are insisting that both Jewish and Palestinian people, Israeli Jewish and Palestinian people, have a right to self-determination and to determine how their state should be organized.
Agnes Kalamar from Amnesty International, thank you very much for joining us on The World this evening. Thank you. Well, earlier, Israeli government spokesperson David Mentzer gave his reaction to the report on Sky News. Have a listen.
This is a classic example of anti-Semitism. It is Holocaust inversion. The crimes committed against my people, Israel, are now, in turn, being accused of this same crime. The reality is that this genocide claim just completely fails to address Hamas's genocidal rhetoric. You know, their leaders call for the eradication of Jews, the wiping of my country off the face of the earth. This report's supposed to be impartial. It's ridiculous.
Well, dozens of hostages, of course, are still being held in Gaza. 28-year-old Emily Damari is the last remaining British national still being held there. Today, her mother, Mandy, spoke to the media in London amid new hopes of a ceasefire and after the publication of that Amnesty report. She stressed that the treatment of hostages still being held in Gaza also amounted to a war crime.
I went to Geneva last week and I spoke to the Human Rights Commission, and I've spoken several times to the president of the Red Cross, the ICRC, and they all agree that what's happening in Gaza to the hostages is a war crime. They're not getting any treatment there. They're not getting any humanitarian aid, and that's what interests me. Again, you're talking about decisions that are above my head.
So that's Mandy, the mother of 28-year-old Emily Damari, still being held as a hostage in Gaza.